So today we're going to be practicing how to make some seashells that are kind of like on the shore, partially in the water. So I already pre-drew a couple different fun little ocean creatures. So I got a starfish and a couple shells. So one thing with starfish, when you're drawing those, a lot of times I like to, instead of doing the whole star thing, sometimes I'll actually put little points for where my starfish is going to be and then make it wider from there, so it kind of looks like a flower. And then I can come in and start making it look more like a starfish. So that's how I like to do starfish. Obviously you can do it any way you want to. And then the bigger shells, sometimes I'll start off as a circle, kind of put a V, like angles at the bottom, and then a little rectangle. And that's a great way to do a really simple shell. Obviously you can make it as simple or complicated as you want. And then I just lightly drew in a little bit of a line for the ocean. And then next what I'm going to start doing is working on my inking. So for that, I probably want to start off with like an 01 pen rather than a really, really small pen. And basically I'm going to start off by outlining the little line for my ocean, and I'm actually going to skip where it kind of touches my starfish because I actually want it to go on top of my starfish, so I could kind of ink that just a little bit. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a shadow underneath my ocean line, and that just creates a little bit of depth with my picture. So I'm just kind of doing side to side hatching right underneath this line. And I could always make it maybe a little bit darker right underneath the water if it doesn't have enough contrast. And then we're going to try and keep this part as white. So, and then next I'm going to start outlining my starfish. So starfish aren't perfectly smooth, so you want to make sure to have a little bit of a texture to it. So when I'm outlining my starfish, I'm not like perfectly outlining it. I'm kind of like doing like little dashes, just little lines. And then I don't want to outline it where that, part of the ocean comes on top, because then it will look weird. So I'm going to kind of outline it here and then stop and skip and then outline the bottom. And this shell, basically going to outline the whole thing. And this shell, but for this one I'm not going to outline the lines, because those lines I'm actually going to make using shading and not really using just a line. So like to shade this shell, I would shade to the side of my line, so then the line is kind of created using shading and contrast rather than a literal line. Makes it a little more interesting. And then for this one, this shell, I kind of made an open shell. So to make it seem like it's open, I probably want to make it a little dark right inside here. And then I could do some little stippling texture on my little starfish. And obviously you could make it more detailed and do more stippling. I could have the patience and time to do lots of really, really tiny dots. That's kind of up to you though. And then underneath my starfish, I'm going to do a little shadow where it's casting a little bit of a shadow on the ocean, like that. And then a little bit over here, a little bit to the side. So obviously you want to spend more time on it than I am. And then next what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my masking fluid pen, and a really important part I want to mask off is the very end of my water where my ocean foam is, and I want it to be really light. And I may not just outline it, I'm kind of doing like the very edge of it and then some little bigger spots back here. And I could do some little reflections in the water. And it's really important to make sure that your masking fluid pen is actually working before you put it on there, because sometimes if the masking fluid's too thin or not coming out enough, it won't come off when you take it off. And I'm going to do a little bit on either side, so I have some little highlights on this shell, probably on this shell, and some little dots for highlights on my starfish. There. Okay, I think that's about it. And then next, I'm going to start prepping some of my colors. So one of the first colors that we're going to do is our starfish color, because basically I want to work on my shells for a thin layer, then the sand, then the ocean, or back and forth. So to make the starfish color, now your starfish could be whatever color you want it to be, but I want to make mine that's kind of like the photo I sent out to everybody, which was more of kind of a pinky kind of tan color. So I'm using some yellow ochre and alizarin crimson. So alizarin crimson's like a really pinky red. Yellow ochre, this is Naples that I'm using because I don't have yellow ochre on here, but it's close enough. And then I'll also put a tiny bit of burnt sienna just to make it a little redder. And I'm gonna do a very light wash over my whole entire starfish, also down here. That's why that masking fluid comes in handy and kind of protects that little line down there. And then, you know, if you didn't like that color, you could always do a different color, like pinks, purples. Starfishes are lots of different colors. I could even dump in maybe some pinks in there for some variety, but a lot of that I'll leave once it's dry. And I'm going to take that same color and do a really light kind of tapping on the top of this shell and a little bit of a pattern on this shell. Like that. And then while that's drying, I'm going to mix my sand color. So my sand color is basically almost the same color, except for instead of using a lot of brown and pink, I'm instead going to use a little bit of purple to my yellow, just like this. And that kind of helps to tone it down because it's a complementary color. So that means it's across the color wheel and helps to tone down the other color. And I want to use this very, very lightly. And basically I'm just going to paint in, probably a little lighter than that, paint in my whole entire sand all the way up. And obviously if you had a little more time, you could always, you know, wait for your starfish to dry before you did the sand, because if your sand and your starfish is really wet, they're going to bleed together. And so I'm just painting that whole entire sand area. And then now, just for some variety, I could come in and add a little pink to my sand color and do some streaks, because sand isn't just one flat color. A lot of times you have lots of different variations, you know, lights and darks in your sand. So you don't want it to be really flat. And while that's drying, I'm also going to do a little bit of pink inside my little conch shell, mini shell. And this is kind of a purpley pink. So, but I don't want it super dark. So I'm going to try and pull out that purple a little bit. There we go. And then I'm going to take a little bit of purple and mix a little bit more with my sand color. And I'm going to put it right up underneath my sea foam. And that's going to be the shadow, because you want that to really pop. And then of course I wouldn't want to leave that line like that. I would take a brush and go like that. Ta-da! So it's a little deeper. And while this is drying, I'm going to mix my ocean colors. So my ocean colors, if you have a color that's like Viridian green, that is fantastic for oceans because it's like a Mediterranean color. But if you don't have Viridian green, you can always mix, you know, your own colors. Like if you have phthalo blue, you can mix some of that with like some yellow, because phthalo blue is kind of a bluey green. And then if you have Viridian, you can make Viridian even brighter by using a little bit of lemon yellow. So, and that's just giving that a second to dry, mixing some ocean colors. So you want, you know, kind of a really bright ocean color and kind of a darker ocean color just by adding more phthalo to it. And then I'm going to take a little bit of sand and I'm going to paint some sand back here, because if you look at the ocean, a lot of times there's a little bit of a sand color underneath the ocean because, you know, the ocean's on top. And so we really want to show that in our picture. So that's why I'm adding some sand and wetting it out with a little water. But don't go too far with your sand. It really should be just really close to the seashells. And then I'm going to take my ocean color, which I'm going to start off kind of light first, at the back. And I'm slowly going to come forward. So if you get that scratchy noise, that's okay, because it actually kind of creates some fun texture in your ocean. But if you don't like that, you can always add a little more water to your paint. So and then I'm just pulling this down so it kind of mixes with my sand. And then as an extra step of depth, that's when you want to take a little darker blue and do some little streaks in your water. So some of that you may have to wait, obviously, until it's dry, because at this stage, sometimes if everything's really wet, it's just going to turn, you know, into one color. So patience is key. And then while that's drying, I'm going to add some more layers to my little starfish. So I still have a lot of my starfish color left, but I may add a little more pink to it. And on one side of my starfish, I'm going to add a little shadow like that. That just gives it a little depth. And I could also tap in some of that pink. I'm making mine a little more pinky in color. But I'm still leaving some of that lighter color showing through. And then on this shell, I would want to add another layer with like burnt sienna, just to add some little darker browns. You know how shells have those little patterns on them. And then I would make gray. Sorry, I think I have ants in here. And then I'm going to make a gray with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue that I'm then going to use on the other side of my little highlight. And that's going to help that highlight to show up really well. And of course, if it gets too gray, that's okay. I can always wet it, and then the highlights will really only be where the masking fluid is, which is perfectly fine. And then I want to take my sand color again and just dab in some little darker shadows right near where the white foam is, like that. And this may be too wet, but I'm going to try and add a little shadow underneath my little starfish on the sand and my other shells. And I would wet that. And then we're going to let this dry just a little bit. And then of course, once your painting is nice and dry, then you would take off the masking fluid. Obviously mine is not dry at this stage. And then this is an example with the masking fluid taken off. So in this picture, this one actually doesn't have any inking, and most of the shadows I did in blue because there was a lot more ocean on them. And then this one, I have a little bit of inking on there, and you can kind of see once the white comes off, that really brings together the painting. And you know, these little white spots, once I take off my masking fluid, I could always decide if I want to paint over those if they're too bright, or I could keep them. So you can kind of see this one I kind of glazed over a little bit. And of course, if you decide that you didn't do enough inking, you could always add more inking on top.